To acquire some detailed knowledge of the life of St. John of the Cross, we have first to place it in the context of 16th century Spain. John lived his adult life in a period of Spanish history that merits the title a golden age. He was about to begin high school in Medina del Campo in 1556 when Philip II became king, a reign which lasted the rest of John's lifetime and beyond. There was an air of vitality and exuberance in Spain during the Golden Age, social, cultural, artistic, and religious. A citizen would be aware that he was living in a climate that embraced the known world, Europe, Africa, the Americas, the Philippines. The Spanish colonial conquista gave him a sense of pride and glory, even though it was gradually taking a heavy toll socially and economically. University centers in Spain during the 16th century increased from 11 to 32. As regards faculties of theology, in 1530 there were 10, in 1568 there were 23. As for architecture, sufficient to mention the cathedrals of Segovia and Salamanca, the Escorial, the cathedral and other public buildings of Toledo, to get an idea of the magnificence and diversity of architectural skills. It was a high point in Spanish literature, prose and poetry, with authors like Cervantes, Lope de Vega, Luis de Góngora, Luis de Leon, and by acclamation, Teresa and John. Our saint was contemporary with a great number of saintly people. Names like Ignatius of Loyola, Luis de Granada, Peter of Alcantara, Francis Borgia, and St. John of Avila were on everybody's lips. In 1563, when John put on the Carmelite habit for the first time at Medina del Campo, the final session of the Council of Trent took place. Implementation of its reforming decrees would influence religion in Spain for the rest of John's life. John was not affected in the same way by all these elements. Political realities affected him only remotely. Religious and cultural matters closely and constantly. And their effect on John was gradual. In his early life, he experienced firsthand the crunch of poverty. Later, the world of learning and culture opened up with studies at Medina and Salamanca. Still later, he fulfilled his destiny when all his creative energies were engaged in search of God through mysticism and contemplation. What follows is intended to be a pen portrait of St. John of the Cross, an association of word and picture to convey an impression of a man who was a poet, a mystic, and a saint. I will attempt to incorporate into the picture the inner development of John's life, such as can be ascertained from his writings, his ministry, and from the testimony of his contemporaries. Our story begins at Fontiveros, a little town situated 24 miles northwest of Avila, located in a fertile agricultural area of the Castilian Plateau. This was the birthplace of St. John of the Cross. In a small house situated near the square tower, the family lived. John was born the youngest of 3 boys to Gonzalo de Yepes and Catalina Alvarez in 1542. Because the parish archives were lost in a fire, we do not know the month or the exact day of his birth. Probable date, June 24. On the site of his birthplace, a Carmelite monastery and church were later built. The altar was positioned just above the room where the saint was born. The cloister and part of the kitchen garden have been preserved. This is how they look today. The building is presently used as a school. One has to reckon here with the fact that in 19th century Spain, religious houses were suppressed. We Carmelites lost many historic monasteries at that time, and a certain traditional continuity was also interrupted in the process. John was baptized in the local church, now a very solidly constructed and imposing building. The town has a much smaller population today than in John's time and is rather insignificant. The celebrated Spanish writer Don Miguel de Unamuno, traveling near Fontiveros about a century ago, wrote, "Passing by Fontiveros, lying on the dust of the plain, I reflected, how can it be that centuries ago this was the birthplace of St. John of the Cross? To console myself, I concluded that the spirit is not dead, but just sleeping." End of quote. A tribute, no doubt, to the greatness of St. John, while alluding to the insignificance of the village at the time when Don Miguel saw it. The baptismal font of dark stone is still seen in a chapel to the left of the main entrance. An inscription reads, "In this font was baptized the mystical doctor St. John of the Cross, the first discalced Carmelite. To the great honor of this illustrious town of Fontiveros, his place of origin. Born 1542 on June 24, he died 1591 December 14. This stone was placed here in the year 1680 when Joseph Velado was pastor." The monument to St. John in the town square is unveiled in November the 11th, 1928. A contemporary chronicle mentions the great crowd of pilgrims who converged on foot, on horseback, and in a noisy cavalcade of automobiles. The bronze sculpture was the work of Ricardo Font, who explained that he wished to represent John as if he were about to take off from the Castilian plain on the wings of the cross. For that reason, the artist placed the figure of an eagle at the intersection of the cross, as also on the pedestal of white granite. Before John was 2 years of age, his father died after a protracted illness, leaving the family in dire poverty. Gonzalo had belonged to a well-to-do family, but had been disinherited after marrying Catalina, whose family was poor. After her husband's death, Catalina tried to get help from some wealthy brothers of his, one of them a priest who lived near Toledo. All in vain. As a result of poverty, Louis, the second son, died, seemingly of malnutrition. So, in 1548, when John was 6 and his brother Francisco about 17, Catalina looked for employment and went first to Arevalo, where the family spent 3 years. We have practically no details of John's life during these years, but we have very interesting information about his brother Francisco from a biography later written by his confessor, José de Velasco. These were troubled years for Francisco and anxious ones for the family. We hear of a constant series of escapades and pranks, occasions where Francisco and companions disturbed the townsfolk with the sound of music and dance, all retiring late to sleep in the church precincts. Some of his companions were, in fact, sacristans. All this surely added to Catalina's burden. However, while still at Arevalo, Francisco experienced a real conversion, and next we hear of him getting married to Ana Izquierda, who then joined the little household of Catalina, where they earned their living at textile work. From the moment of conversion, Francisco lived a very devout life, being especially devoted to prayer. Unfortunately, 7 out of his 8 children died young. John was witness to his older brother's troubled years. We can only guess how he felt at this tender age as he shared the distress of the family, particularly his mother's anguish. Later, John showed very tender affection for Francisco. At John's invitation, Francisco spent long periods with him at Duruelo, Granada, and Segovia. In 1551, when Francisco was about 20 years of age and John was 9, the family moved to Medina del Campo for greater job opportunities. This was a busy market town dominated by the great fortress of the Marquis de la Mota. This Castle de la Mota may have served as inspiration for Teresa's idea of the interior castle. She would have seen it many times in her travels. In Medina, Francisco, Anna, and Catalina readily found employment in the textile business. John was placed in a type of orphanage called Colegio de los Niños de la Doctrina, close to his home in the Calle Santiago. His early experience of poverty had a profound and strangely beneficial influence in his life. Ever afterward, he was attuned to simple living and keenly aware of the need of loving dependence on God. It may have been in some way due to his early experience of triumphing over poverty that he showed such resolution and tenacity in later life. Certain it is that the experience never affected him adversely. Indeed, it caused him to be always alert in his efforts to alleviate poverty in others. In addition to learning grammar, Christian doctrine, and some work skills, John served as acolyte at the Church of St. Mary Magdalene, belonging to the Augustinian nuns. The sisters noted his great devotion and recollection as he ministered at the altar. At age 17, we find John working as an infirmarian at the local Hospital de la Concepción de las Bubas. The name signifies the type of patient treated there. His duties were twofold: to look after the sick and to beg for alms to support this charitable institution. The administrator, Don Alonso Alvarez, perhaps at the prompting of the Augustinian nuns, allowed John to study the humanities course at the nearby Jesuit school. Records show that excellent courses were provided here at this time, and John was a model student. The school at Medina was not only preparatory to university studies, but in fact embraced some university courses. We know that philosophy was taught there, and the arts and humanities courses were described in detail by one of John's great teachers, Father Boniface. I translate difficult parts of the breviary and church hymns, the Catechism, the letters of St. Jerome, the Acts of the Council of Trent. For my regular students, I read Cicero, Virgil, and at times the tragedies of Seneca. I also read Horace and Martial, Caesar, Sallust, and Livy, in order that the student have a full selection of speeches, poetry, and history. End of quote. The course here described is at the level of a university college, and we should not fail to attribute in due measure to this period John's subsequent literary and poetic skill. Of the school buildings, only the church remains today. In 1563, at the age of 21, John completed his secular studies. By then he had his mind made up concerning his vocation. He applied and was accepted into the novitiate of the Carmelite monastery of Santa Ana. His brother Francisco adds a significant detail. When John applied to the Carmelites of the monastery of Santa Ana and asked to be clothed in the religious habit, the prior and community assembled and immediately granted his request. John took as religious name John of St. Matthias. Almost nothing of the monastery remains today. There is a remnant of a wall off which opened the door to a chapel where, according to tradition, John celebrated his first Mass after ordination in 1567. In this chapel dedicated to the saint, a commemorative plaque reads, "To the great lyrical poet of Castile, mystical doctor of the Church, St. John of the Cross, in homage and in memory of his first Mass celebrated in this chapel." After a year's novitiate, John made his profession. Immediately after his profession, he got permission to follow the primitive rule of the order. In this, he committed himself to follow certain observances which had lapsed following the mitigation introduced in 1432 by authority of Pope Eugene IV. The two principal mitigations had to do with, firstly, abstinence from meat, and secondly, cloister living. In view of later developments, John's commitment is very significant. In the fall of 1564, he was sent to the University of Salamanca, 50 miles away, to study for the priesthood. Up till now, he had experience of living in Fontiveros, Arevalo, and Medina, in a kind of ascending scale from the civic and cultural viewpoint. Salamanca was a totally new departure, a veritable metropolis. It contained at this time some of the most splendid and imposing architecture of Europe. One can imagine the impact of all this on a young student fresh from the novitiate. Besides, this is a very flourishing period at the University of Salamanca, which was on a par with the great universities of Paris, Bologna, and Oxford. He lived at the Carmelite College of San Andres, situated by the Roman Bridge. Besides his studies at the university, where he was enrolled, John also attended classes at San Andres. Nearby was the imposing monastery of the Dominicans, St. Stephen's. John enrolled in the Faculty of Arts, that is philosophy, in January 1565. Each day, going to class, he would leave the monastery of San Andres on foot, climb the steep road past the two great cathedrals, one still under construction at the time. He would pass in front of the university with its very elegant facade in the Plateresca style, much favored at the time and still admired today. He would find himself in the graceful cloister of the Escuela Mayor, onto which opened the class halls. We have no contemporary record which would indicate the young student's reaction to the artistic splendor to be seen as he traversed the streets of the city. A stereotyped view of John might lead us to think that he passed by oblivious of it all. Yet surely the man who later showed such an exquisite aesthetic sense in his life and in his poetry cannot have failed to appreciate and take delight in the many artistic achievements of the age. Salamanca's churches, university buildings, artworks, even the imposing palaces of the nobility and the wealthy must have resonated in the heart of the author of the spiritual canticle. Miguel de Unamuno, at a later time rector of the university, wrote, "There are old streets that pass by palaces and churches, ornately gilded down through the ages. There one may surrender oneself and dream of a heavenly Spain suspended forever from the stars." End of quote. Many eminent professors lectured in Salamanca at this time of great intellectual activity. Among them, in philosophy, Enrique Hernandez, Francisco Navarro, Francisco Sanchez, In theology, Luis de Leon and Father Mancio were the successor to Francisco de Vitoria and Melchior Cano, and in scripture, Gaspar Grajal and Gregorio Gallo. Still preserved is the hall where the Augustinian Luis de Leon lectured. It was he who later, in 1588, published the first edition of St. Teresa's works. He was a theologian, a mystic, and a great literary figure. But he came into conflict with the Inquisition and spent some years in prison. According to legend, after his release, he began his first lecture thus: "As I was saying yesterday." We have much information about John's environment during this 4-year period. The Carmelites had come to Salamanca in 1480. Soon the foundation became a kind of interprovincial center of studies for Spain. Successive general chapters legislated for it. In the same year that John enrolled in Salamanca, a general chapter in Rome directed that the students be well received, that daily life have an austere character, and that there be recollection and religious observance. It also provided for an extension to the building. However, the community never became very large. Father General Rossi visited the college in 1566 while John was a student. At that time, there were 4 students of theology and 7 of philosophy. The whole life of Salamanca revolved around the university. Its ebb and flow, its festivities, processions, celebrations. If we might encapsulate in a phrase the tenor of John's life at Salamanca, it could be a religious and a student, but above all a religious. This is his own phrase, later recommended to students who were in his charge. Here at Salamanca, John acquired all the theological skill subsequently manifested in his writings. He always remained a diligent student, though he valued theology mostly as a basis for mystical wisdom. His writings manifest also a profound penetration of the meaning of the scriptures. In 1567, probably early summer, John was ordained priest. But it was not until September that he returned to Medina del Campo to celebrate his first Mass in the presence of his mother, elder brother Francisco, and friends. This was surely an occasion for intense family rejoicing. Who could have surmised that during his student years at Salamanca, John experienced a vocational crisis? Of the fact, we are certain. When he met St. Teresa for the first time in the fall of 1567, he told her that he intended to join the Carthusians. The reasons that led to this decision we do not know. He had embraced the Carmelite life with full knowledge and enthusiasm and seemed to be a model student. Yet by the time of his ordination, he had decided to transfer to an eremitical way of life. The reason is possibly to be sought in his limited experience of religious life to date. It would seem that he could not yet reconcile a deep contemplative vocation to which he felt called with the exigencies of student life and apostolate. A time would come when he would resolve in his own religious experience the seeming polarity of action and contemplation. Saint Teresa providentially helped him resolve his present vocational crisis. She promised that he would find in Carmel what he was about to seek among the Carthusians. Teresa had come to Medina to found a convent. The reform of the nuns had begun 5 years previously at San Jose, Avila, and this foundation at Medina was the first in a series of 15 that Teresa was to make in the next 15 years. Teresa and John met in the parlor of the new foundation. he manifested to her that he had been giving thought to joining the Carthusians in search of greater solitude and recollection. Very persuasively, she told him of her plans for the reform of the friars. He expressed great interest, said he would be at her disposal in the project, provided it was not too long deferred. Then he returned to Salamanca to complete his studies. We find John at Medina again in the summer of 1568. He went with Teresa to the foundation of Valladolid and stayed there from August to October the 1st. Then, in November, Father Antonio de Heredia and he, Teresa described them as a friar and a half, began the reform of the friars in the isolated little hamlet of Duruelo. The poverty, simplicity, and seclusion must have been the fulfillment of all John's aspirations at this period of his life. The name Duruelo will always be synonymous in Carmelite history with the cradle or Bethlehem of the Reform. Duruelo initiated a new form of contemplative life, a religious renewal, a special religious experience. It was for Carmelite men what the foundation of San Jose in 1562 was for the nuns. In the Book of the Foundations, chapter 14, Teresa gives us, in her own inimitable style, her impression of the early days at Duruelo. I couldn't thank the Lord enough when I saw the little house, which shortly before was uninhabitable, with such a spirit that everywhere I looked I found something edifying. And by the way they were living, I learned of the mortification, prayer, and good example they were giving. I experienced the greatest interior joy, for it seemed to me that I saw a beginning that would be of such benefit to our order and service to the Lord. End of quote. Inauguration was on November 28, 1568. A few other religious were present when Father Provincial Alonso Gonzalez celebrated Mass. Father Antonio Heredia, John of St. Matthias, and Brother Jose approached the altar. They promised to live henceforth according to the primitive rule of Carmel. To mark the change, they took new names: Anthony of Jesus, John of the Cross, and Jose de Cristo. It was noted at the time that their new surnames added up to Jesus Christ Crucified. Father Antonio became vicar and John novice master. Brother Jose, the third member of the group, possessed some constructional skills. Thus was the Carmelite reform inaugurated. The original community remained less than 2 years at Duruelo. By then, the house, never more than a little dovecot, was too small to accommodate the number of religious, and they transferred to a house put at their disposal in a nearby village called Mancera de Abajo. John was here for about a year. No trace remains of the original monastery. The site is now occupied by a Carmelite nun's cloister. In October 1570, John was called to Pastrana, about 35 miles east of Alcalá de Henares. This second monastery for men had been founded over a year previously. John was called to Pastrana to moderate the rigorous penitential excesses of the first novice master. John was asked to moderate extreme forms of penance a number of times in his life, and he did so gently but firmly, insisting that while such excesses might have an aura of piety, in fact they could very well be ill-conceived and ill-directed, destructive of genuine holiness, and not at all a reflection of the mind of the founders of the Reformed Carmel. Whatever physical austerities John practiced, he seldom commends them to others. he emphasizes not so much mortification of the flesh, but mortification of desire. He sometimes goes out of his way to comment on those who burden themselves and others with extraordinary penances, thinking that this will bring them to union. Such is not the case, he says, if they do not strive diligently to mortify their desires and appetites. The Pastrana monastery had an interesting beginning. Ambrogio Mariano and Giovanni Narducci, both Italians, had come to Spain and resided as hermits in caves on a plot of ground given them by the Prince of Eboli. In 1569, they offered the spot to the Discalced as a foundation, and they themselves took the habit of Carmel as lay brothers, making their professions in 1570 in the presence of Saint Teresa. Both made their mark in the early reform. Mariano, amazingly versatile, had been a medical doctor, architect, mathematician, and engineer. As a student, he had as classmate the future Pope Gregory XIII. Later, as a theologian, he attended the Council of Trent. Philip II at one time commissioned him to investigate whether the river Guadalquivir could be made navigable between Seville and Cordoba. Ordained priest in 1574, he held many offices, was rector of Alcalá, founded houses in Lisbon and Madrid. Giovanni Narducci, better known as Juan de la Miseria, is remembered especially as the artist who gave us a portrait from life of Saint Teresa. It was painted in Seville in 1576 when she was 61. It was of that portrait that Teresa jokingly said, "May God forgive you, Fray Juan, for having me endure so much, and then making me look so ugly and bleary-eyed." At the top of the hill still stands the oratory of San Pedro near the remains of the convent. Inside the oratory is an Ecce Homo painted by Fray Juan de la Miseria, disfigured by the revolutionaries during the Civil War in 1936. The Franciscans, who acquired the buildings in the last century and made them into a mission seminary for the Philippines, have placed an inscription to commemorate the original Carmelite foundation at Pastrana. Tradition points out a cave where John of the Cross lived during his brief sojourn. From it, there is a panoramic view of the very fertile valley. This must have appealed very much to John's aesthetic and poetic sense. The third foundation for men was made in December 1570 at Alcalá de Henares, a university town since 1498 and a center of Spanish culture. It was the birthplace of Miguel Cervantes, renowned in world literature as the author of Don Quixote, or, as the book was entitled in the first edition of 1605, El Ingenioso Hidalgo Don Quixote de la Mancha. Faithful to Teresa's love of learning and culture, the idea was to have a house of studies for young religious after completing their novitiate at Pastrana. Thus, the College of St. Cyril came into being. After the monastic suppression in 1836, it became a prison and can still be seen in the Calle de los Colegios. John was appointed first rector there in 1571, but remained only a short while. Early in 1572, we find him, together with another religious, in Avila as confessor and spiritual director to the nuns of the Incarnation. Saint Teresa, by order of the apostolic visitor, had been made prioress there in October of the previous year and had asked that John be assigned as confessor. With his help, she hoped to effect a real improvement in the spiritual life of the nuns. For a year, John and his companion lived in the monastery of the Carmelites, while John attended to the spiritual welfare of the nuns. Of that monastery, only the bell tower remains, towering over one of the gateways of the city. Then the two transferred to the chaplain's house adjacent to the Incarnation. Today it is an oratory within the cloister. For 2 years, John and Teresa lived thus close to each other. It was a privileged time for both, as they came to appreciate each other's distinct though complementary qualities, to develop their understanding of the new Carmelite charism, and to plan for the future of the reform. John was now 30 years old, Teresa was 57. None of John's writings had yet appeared. On the Feast of the Holy Trinity, 1573, both saints went into ecstasy in the parlor of the monastery. The following year, when her term as prioress ended, Teresa returned to the monastery of San Jose, while John continued as confessor and ecclesiastical superior at the Incarnation. In 1577, from a tribune overlooking the church, John had a vision of Christ crucified. He made a sketch which is still preserved in the Incarnation Convent. It was shown to Salvador Dali in 1950, and it served as an inspiration for his famous painting, The Christ of St. John of the Cross. From the year 1574, relations between the parent order and the Reform had become hopelessly embroiled, partly due to a most complex and perplexing clash of jurisdictions. By 1577, things had reached breaking point. During the night of December 1st, 1577, John and his companion were taken by force from the chaplain's house. They were separated from one another, and John was taken to Toledo and imprisoned in the monastery of the Carmelites. He was placed in the monastic prison, which happened to be an unused closet 10 feet by 6 feet, with only a slit high up in the wall for light and air. The monastery was in the place now named Paseo del Carmen, and enjoyed a splendid view of the river Tagus, where it curves near the Alcantara Bridge. During his imprisonment, it is very unlikely that John ever enjoyed this view, which would have been a joy to him in those dark days. For a full 9 months, he was subject to the closest surveillance, interrogation, fasting, and discipline, a veritable dark night. What could better describe John's feelings at this time than the first stanza of the spiritual canticle? Whither have you vanished, beloved, and left me full of sorrow? You fled like a stag after wounding me. I went after you, calling, and you were gone. A ray of light percolated into the darkness during the last 4 months of his imprisonment. It came in the person of a young religious who had just been assigned to the monastery of Toledo and was designated as his jailer. This man was much more lenient than his predecessor. Indeed, he came in time to be somewhat of a friend of St. John. He gave him some additional clothes, better rations of food, pen and paper at John's request, and occasional opportunities to observe the location of the monastery. No doubt, John availed of the opportunities offered, and once he had decided to escape, used his observations to plan the route. Then, as if miraculously, one night during the octave of the Assumption 1578, using strips of blanket, he lowered himself from a window to the boundary wall. Today, the spot is marked on the retaining wall of the ancient monastery by a plaque bearing the first stanza of his poem, en una noche oscura, composed in prison. One dark night, inflamed with love's urgent longings, O happy lot, I went out unseen, my house being now at rest. And it continues, the second stanza, in darkness and secure, by the secret ladder disguised, O happy lot, in darkness and concealment, my house being now at rest. The conclusion of the first stanza, I went out unseen, my house being now at rest, is evocative of the escape. In the dark, he made his way past the Plaza de Zocodover. He looked wretched in a torn habit, emaciated, frightened lest he be recaptured. If he could only discover the Carmelite nuns' cloister, founded by Teresa in 1569, he would be safe. He kept on through the dark streets, the ribald sounds of late-night revelers adding to his fright. He discovered in passing an open doorway, entered and got permission to stay the night. Next morning early, having got directions to the Carmelite cloister, he hastened on his way. He arrived at the Carmelite sisters' cloister and gained admittance. His pursuers were neatly sidetracked by the portress. In subsequent days, he spoke to the sisters, reciting for them some stanzas of poetry, profound and sublime, which he had composed on scraps of paper in prison. One of John's poems is very revealing as to his mystical reaction to the prison experience. It deals with the soul which rejoices in knowing God in darkness and through faith. God is perceived as a spring which flows and runs, even though it is night, a spring ultimately revealed in the living bread, the Eucharist. How well I know the spring that flows and runs, although it is night. That eternal spring is hidden. How well I know where it has its source, although it is night. I do not know its origin, for it has not got one, but I know that every origin has come from it, although it is night. This eternal spring is hidden in this living and life-giving bread, although it is night. Later, commentaries on his poetry would form the bulk of his literary work, in fact, all his major works. For an understanding of John's spiritual growth, a vital factor is the interior reaction to all that took place at Toledo. It has been well termed the transformation or the Tabor of St. John of the Cross. The prison at Toledo was not just a narrow cell, solitary confinement, cruel and unusual punishment. It was that, but also it was the flowering of a mystical experience expressed in poetry of rare intensity and poignancy, full of love and longing for the beloved, in language of courtly affection. This is the mystery which we need to confront and try to understand, how a love like this could germinate and flourish in the context of such exquisite suffering. For it was out of the darkness of Toledo that the mystical experience and writings of St. John shone forth to spread their rays throughout Christendom. While his body lay in a dungeon, his spirit soared to such a height that he could write, O guiding night, O night more lovely than the dawn, O night that has joined the lover with his beloved and changed her into her love. This guided me more surely than the noonday sun, to where he awaited me, him I know so well, in a place where no one else appeared. The Carmelite sisters in Toledo entrusted John to their friend and benefactor, Don Pedro Gonzalez de Mendoza, canon of the cathedral. He was also administrator of a hospital nearby, and there, in safety, John was treated and restored to health. However, he bore the physical scars of his ordeal for the rest of his life. In October 1578, the provincial chapter held in Almodovar del Campo appointed John superior of the monastery of El Calvario in the southern region of Andalusia near Beas, thus effectively removing him from the perils of life in Castile. Scarcely a trace of the original monastery remains, just an inscription on a boulder by the roadside to mark the spot. Amidst the olive trees stand the remains of an old farmhouse which belonged to the monastery. During the 8 months which John spent here after his prison experience, he relished his beloved solitude, communing with nature and with God in the verdant hills and valleys stretching down from the hilltop to the winding course of the river Guadalquivir. After the 9 months of incarceration at Toledo, El Calvario was almost too good to be true. Now he had an entire 8 months to savor the peace and beauty of this rustic spot. The spaciousness, the freedom, the light, the sight of the mountain, sky, and valley must surely have been balm to his spirit. John's keen artistic appreciation of nature is evident in verses like these from the spiritual canticle. My beloved, like the mountains and solitary wooded valleys, strange islands and resounding rivers, the murmuring of love-laden breezes, the tranquil night at the approach of dawn, silent music, echoing solitude, the supper that refreshes and evokes love. Let us rejoice, beloved. Let us go forth to see ourselves in your beauty, to the mountain, to the hill, to where the pure water flows. At a few hours' walking distance were the Carmelite sisters at Beas, where Mother Anna of Jesus was prioress. They invited him to give them some lectures, and regularly, every weekend, he would go there and give them spiritual conferences, commenting on the stanzas of his poetry. This would seem to be the beginning of his literary output, coming at a time when he had just plumbed the depths of redemptive suffering as he approached the apex of his mystical and poetic powers. It was at this time that he designed the sketch of the Mount of Carmel in order to illustrate graphically the way to perfection. It is a panoramic view of the approach to God as described in his commentaries. It acquired very great significance both for John himself and for those whom he directed. As many as 60 Carmelites, men and women, testified to having received from him personally a copy of this drawing. All the copies were small in format, such as could fit between the pages of a breviary or prayer book. Mother Magdalene, to whom John gave a copy inscribed to Mi hija Magdalena, said that he composed the design at Beas and gave a copy made by himself to each of the sisters to be placed in their breviaries. The design, oval-shaped and in the form of a line drawing, is highlighted by phrases indicating the need for total detachment. At the top of the mountain, reached by a central path straight to the summit, are the fruits of the Holy Spirit: peace, joy, happiness, delight, piety, love, fortitude, justice, and wisdom. There we encounter the biblical text, "I have brought you to the land of Carmel, that you may eat its good fruits and enjoy them." At the apex is the phrase, "On this mountain there is only the honor and glory of God." Finally, crowning all, the phrase, "Here is no longer any path, since for the just there is no law." It was during his ministry at El Calvario, Beas, that he composed what are called his minor works, maxims, precautions, sayings of light and love, and so on. They are important for a knowledge of his full spiritual message, and they were a prelude, so to speak, to the full flowering of his literary genius in his major works during the next 10 years. Close to the celebrated palace of the Alhambra. Here is the famous courtyard of the Lions within the splendid Moorish palace. It is a place visited by every tourist to Granada, in the context of which we all think of Washington Irving's Chronicle of the Conquest of Granada. Los Martires was lost to the Carmelites as a result of the suppression laws and is now a public garden, somewhat difficult of access. It provides a wonderful panorama of the city and of the distant mountains. Of the monastery, little remains. An aqueduct, said to be constructed under the direction of John to bring a supply of water to the monastery. This had become a vital necessity at one stage for the community. John remained in Granada 6 years, 4 as prior and 2 as vicar provincial for Andalusia. Granada might be termed the scriptorium of St. John of the Cross. It was during his 6 years at Granada that he wrote practically the entire commentary on the Ascent of Mount Carmel, the commentary on the Dark Night, some additional verses, and the commentary on the Spiritual Canticle, and finally the Living Flame. All this was accomplished amidst an absorbing apostolate, his work as superior, founder, spiritual director, involving numerous and onerous journeys. Indeed, all his writings seem to have been conceived, born, and lived out in intimate contact with his daily apostolic experience. In this brief period, he left us works of permanent literary and doctrinal value. These were his mature years, from age 40 to 46. It would seem that all his spiritual energy, the accumulation of years of contemplation, poetic gifts, and purification through suffering surged forth in his spiritual legacy to the Church and to the world. In 1581, he was instrumental in the foundation of the Carmelite cloister in Granada, of which Anna of Jesus became prioress. He became confessor and spiritual director to this convent. Anna was one of the pillars of St. Teresa's reform, later an intrepid defender and interpreter of the Teresian spirit. Using a walking stick, John would go on foot down the hill to the convent once a week, giving regular lectures to the nuns. It was for Mother Anna that he wrote his commentary on the Spiritual Canticle, that classical poem whose verses began to pour from the depths of his spirit during his imprisonment in Toledo. He was friend and spiritual director also of a noble lady, Anna of Peñalosa, at this time. For her, he wrote the last of his major works, The Living Flame of Love. Now, at the completion of his writings, let us just for a moment take a bird's-eye view of them all. Luis de Leon, St. Teresa's first editor, spoke of her writings as one of two living images she has left us of herself, the other being her Carmelite nuns. John's works also, taken together, give us a faithful likeness of him, each contributing a part of the picture. They are best regarded as a developing process, all details of a large canvas which can only be understood in the total context. John was at pains to point out, as the reader progresses with the text, he will find himself understanding the first part better, since one part will explain another. The Ascent and Dark Night emphasize the logical intelligence, going forward or upward without deviation, in virtue of firm theological principles in search of God. They classify and evaluate ascetical and mystical experience, stripping them of the ephemeral and the relative, piercing with light and love the immediate darkness of the night and the nada, reaching out with unerring instinct to God in the terrifying realism of the nights. It is interesting to note that John left both treatises incomplete, probably intending to finish them later. We may well imagine that he was in a hurry, as it were, to come to the very center or apex of his spiritual message, mystical union with God to be treated in the Canticle and the Living Flame. The Canticle is shot through with exuberant color and imagery. Meadows, streams, vineyards, shepherds and pastures, groves and wild flowers, wounded deer and white doves, all grace the love-strewn pages of this beautiful work. Theology, the language of love, and mystical poetry combine in a blaze of light and richness to try to describe the soul's tryst with God. And finally, in the living flame, ideas, images, words take on the incandescence of fire. We see the heart of John immersed in the eternal flame of love, finally and joyfully at one with the beloved. Let us listen for a moment to one of John's golden passages as he describes the final loving union with God. In this interior union, God communicates himself to the soul with a love so true that there is no love to be compared to it, not the tenderest love of a mother for her son, not the love of a brother or that of a dearest friend. The tenderness and truth of the love by which this wonderful Father delights and elevates this humble and loving soul reaches the stage that the Father himself submits to her in order to raise her up. It is as though he were her slave and she his master. Oh, how wonderful is this, how awesome, how admirable. So profound is God's humility and graciousness. End of quote. It is only in the light of passages such as this, which abound in John's works, that we can understand the emphasis he places on negation. Nothing created, not even the gift of love, can compare to or be considered in the same breath as God himself. The only way to come to union with God, to come to divine light and love, is inexorably through darkness. The dark night, searing, even daunting at times, has to precede the spiritual canticle and the living flame. All our natural desires, our human ways of understanding and loving, must be purified as if by fire. And here God must enter in to complement and ultimately absorb our own efforts. John's darkness is not pure negation. It is rather the surrender of a lesser light to make way for the light which comes from the divine. Between 1585 and 87, John, as vicar provincial, journeyed through Andalusia, visiting convents and founding new ones. He was responsible for the foundations of Córdoba, Manchuela, and Caravaca de la Cruz. In June 1588, at the Madrid chapter, the Reformed Carmel became, in effect, a separate independent congregation. Father Doria became the first Vicar General. John was elected definitor and member of the Consulta and transferred to Segovia in Castile, where that governing body was located. John thus returned once again to his native Castile. Very likely this homecoming touched a responsive chord in his sensitive, poetic temperament. However much his religious obedience had given him contentment amidst the olive groves of Andalusia. He had left Avila a prisoner 10 years earlier. Now, at age 46, he returned to Segovia, a person much esteemed. After a very busy period of his life in Andalusia, he came back to the relative solitude of a monastery whose situation outside of the city provided wonderful scope for reflection and prayer. Yet even here he was able to combine his contemplation with apostolic activity. He was assigned to Segovia as prior of the house, first counselor, and pro-vicar general of the order. With his arrival in Segovia, an era seemed to have ended for St. John. After the Granada years, during which he composed the bulk of his commentaries, writing now took a secondary place. In Segovia, he reverted once again to an apostolate he preferred most of all, confessor and spiritual director. However, we have from this period a goodly proportion, 12, of his 33 extant letters. Few as they are, his letters are a gold mine of information concerning his life and spirit. The style of his letters is varied. Some are of an official character, others have to do with spiritual direction, others are of a personal nature. These latter are more spontaneous, showing his feelings as he appeals from the heart, revealing his affection, friendship, sorrow when distance separates him for long periods from his friends. To Mother Anna of Jesus at Beas, he writes, "Your letter was a great comfort to me. May the Lord repay you. My failure to write was not due to any unwillingness, for indeed I desire your great good, but to my belief that enough has already been said." To the nuns at Beas, "Do you think that I have lost sight of you and ceased considering how with great ease you can become saints? I am coming to Beas, and you will see how I have not forgotten." To Madre Catalina from Vezza in 1581, "Jesus be with your soul, my daughter Catalina. Although I know not where you are, I want to write these lines, trusting that our Madre, Teresa, will send them on to you if you are not with her. If you are not, be consoled with the thought that you are not abandoned and alone as I am down here. After the whale swallowed me up," a reference to his prison, "I have never merited to see you again or the saints up there. God has done well, for the endurance of darkness leads to great light." Through the generosity of John's friend Anna de Peñalosa, the old building in Segovia was demolished and a new monastery built. Anna was a native of Segovia, and when her husband died, she left Segovia for Granada, where her brother lived and where John had been her confessor and director. St. John had in his young days mastered some constructional skills. Now he regularly joined the workmen on the building site. The Segovia cloister, after recent restoration, is admired for its elegant architectural lines. The house is presently a flourishing retreat house and renewal center. John extended the grounds of the monastery by purchasing some property, notably the Peñas Grajeras, Crow's Rocks, some high land dotted with caves overlooking the convent. He loved to spend time at this spot in contemplation, admiring the scenic beauty. A hermitage today marks this delightful location. A tree nearby, now withered, is said to have been planted by him. John had been instrumental in establishing a Carmelite cloister in Segovia in 1574. Now he ministered spiritually to the sisters, visiting the monastery every week. It was a continuation of his ministry to the nuns at Beas and Granada. In the museum of the Friars Monastery is preserved a painting in leather of Christ carrying the cross. It had been placed in the church by St. John. One day he heard the voice of Christ, "Brother John, what do you wish in return for your service to me?" The saint replied, "Lord, I want to suffer much for you and to be held in contempt by all." His request would be granted through a strange succession of events. The theme of Christ thus speaking to St. John evidently caught the attention and imagination of many painters and artists. Different versions of it, always with rays of light streaming from the crucified to the saint, are found in as many as 9 monasteries in Spain. Borne on the rays of light are the words spoken by Christ and John. The background and other details vary with the different artistic representations. 1589 and 1590 was a time of great tension in the Teresian reform. Questioning arose, especially on the part of Father Gratian and the nuns, concerning the style of authority exercised by Father Doria and the consulta. Inevitably, John was drawn into the controversy. He kept his peace for a good while, but finally he began to comment on certain excesses, and though he did so in a restrained manner, his authority in the reform carried much weight. He encountered much opposition and misunderstanding. He emerged from a tension-filled chapter in Madrid in June 1591 without any office whatsoever. A suggestion that he lead a mission to Mexico fell through, and he was sent back to Andalusia to a little monastery, La Penuela, in a remote corner of the Sierra Morena. It was his own prediction that he would be thrown into a corner like an old rag. No trace of the monastery remains now. Even the locality has changed much since John's day. It is at this moment of John's life that we recall a verse of the spiritual canticle penned years earlier. Now my soul has occupied itself and all my strength in his service. I no longer tend the flock, nor have any other office. My sole exercise is love. A chapel dedicated to St. John has been erected on the probable site of his cell in La Penuela. Here he felt the onset of the illness which was to claim his life by year's end. He was just 49 years old. He was much saddened while at La Penuela to learn that one of his own brethren, Father Diego Evangelista, was engaged in a process of accusation against him and Father Gratian. Ultimately, this led to Gratian's expulsion from the order. John reacted graciously, seeking to placate the minds of all who wrote or spoke to him about it. The process became largely academic in John's case, for his health was rapidly deteriorating. In September, he left La Penuela for Úbeda, where it might be possible to obtain some medical treatment. It was a journey of about 10 kilometers. On the way, he crossed this old Roman bridge of Akita. A story goes that he expressed a desire for asparagus, and his traveling companion found a little bundle of it tied with an osier twig as if destined for market. It was not the season for asparagus. Just before his departure from La Penuela, John wrote to his friend Ana de Peñalosa, "Tomorrow I go to Úbeda to cure a slight bout of fever. I have been suffering from it daily for over a week, so I think I need medical help. But I go with the intention of returning here again, for in truth I am deriving great good from this holy retreat." Alas, the illness was more serious than he thought. He would never return to his holy retreat. Through this entrance door of Úbeda, he entered the Carmelite monastery, his final journey in a journey-filled life. To put St. John's life apostolate in its context, we have to reckon with his frequent traveling. Allowing that most of it was done on foot or on a donkey, the mileage is impressive and shows us a man very much on the move. Charting only documented travel, we come up with the following figures for various periods of his Carmelite life. From 1569 to 78, 2,200 miles. From 1578 to 82, while he was at Calvario and Beas, 4,500 miles. From 1582 to 88, the period in Granada, 9,100 miles. And from 1588 to 91, 570 miles. An astounding total of 16,370 miles along roads, the condition of which is difficult for us to imagine with our centralized system of freeways and paved highways. How often St. Teresa, describing her travels throughout Spain, reminds us of the wretched state of the roads and the inns. Ubeda had been founded just 4 years previously. He had chosen to go where he was unknown, having never ministered there. He was not too well received by the superior, who assigned him the poorest cell in the monastery. Here he was to spend the last couple of months of his life, visited by a few faithful friends, among them his old companion at Duruelo, Father Antonio, now the provincial of Andalusia. These two had been the first friars of the Reform at Duruelo, St. Teresa's friar and a half. Now, after 23 years, their paths crossed again as John was dying. It was a moment to savor, for the memories enshrined. The monastery commanded a splendid view of hills and valleys, sloping down to the Guadalquivir, meandering lazily on its way. John would have liked the natural surroundings had he been informed to appreciate and admire them. But despite some treatment in the monastery, his condition worsened, causing much suffering. On Friday evening, December 13, it was evident that John was dying. Father Antonio and a number of religious were reciting the prayers of commendation. John requested that someone read for him from the Song of Songs. What could be more appropriate than, "Arise, my beloved, my beautiful one, and come. Lo, the winter is past, the rains are over and gone, the flowers appear on the earth, the time of pruning the vines has come, and the song of the dove is heard in our land." Coming up to midnight, most of the religious left the room to go to matins. On hearing the bell, John asked of those who remained, "Why is the bell tolling?" They informed him it was for matins. He said, "Glory be to God, for I shall recite them in heaven." He kissed the crucifix which he was holding in his hands and said slowly in Latin the words of the psalm, "Into your hands, Lord, I commend my spirit." And so he died. It was Saturday, December 14, 1591. He was buried in the small monastery church. As we reflect on his death, so tranquil despite the poverty and suffering, we think perhaps of the last stanza of the dark night. "I stood still and forgot myself, laying my face on my beloved. All things ceased. I went out from myself, leaving my cares among the lilies forgotten." Another appropriate passage might be the last lines of the spiritual canticle. "For the long siege is over, and the horsemen, halting here, dismount and gaze upon the waters clear." Today, his original burial place is marked by a tomb with a statue sculpted by Francisco Palma Burgos. We remember, however, his great friend and benefactor Anna de Peñalosa. In 1593, in accordance with a promise made to her by the order in 1586, the Vicar General, Father Nicholas Doria, had the body transferred to Segovia. It was buried first in a regular grave in the church pavement. Then the remains were placed over the altar in the apse of the chapel, which was re-embellished in 1927, the year after he was proclaimed a doctor of the church. There, the mystical doctor par excellence, saint, poet of the dark night and the living flame, awaits the resurrection. Back at Ubeda, the cell in which he died was made into a chapel, which became a kind of upstairs choir. Some relics of his body were also returned to Ubeda to placate the townspeople who were naturally indignant at the transfer of his body to Segovia. A whole wing of the convent at Ubeda has been made into a museum in his honor. It is very skillfully arranged and a delight to visit. St. John of the Cross was beatified in 1675, canonized in 1726, and declared a doctor of the church in 1926. Father Eliseo of the Martyrs, a companion of St. John at Beza, leaves us this pen picture of him. He was of medium size, somewhat swarthy, but of good features. His bearing and conversation were peaceful, very spiritual, and full of profit for his hearers. He had a deep knowledge and experience of prayer and contact with God. He was fond of recollection, and his laughter was rare and controlled. End of quote. St. John, both as a person and as a writer, has not had the advantage of a favorable press. Too many seem to remember him only in association with the dark nights, the nada, and negation. All students of St. John are at pains to dispel these unbalanced misconceptions. John's contemporaries are unanimous in affirming his kindness, gentleness, and grace. In his presence, people sensed the refinement which lay in the depth of his soul and was a true reflection of his spirit. Reading St. John and reflecting on his life, we are aware of the veritable abyss which separates our half-hearted spirituality from his total commitment and fidelity to God. Yet it does us good, so to speak, to touch the fringe of his garment, something of his generosity, his self-oblation, his intense dedication rubs off on us, and we are the better for the encounter with his loving personality. A coal from the furnace of his love touches our lips, and we are purified in the process.